Hello. Here we are, part 3 of ancient Sumer. You know, these plaques just keep giving and giving. We've been talking about Inanna's journey, right? Triple goddess, queen of heaven, queen of the earth. And now, guess what happens? Well, you can read along. Again, I've kind of updated or uploaded some stuff in your modules regarding the descent. And apologies if there's like a typo. It's Descent. There's a whole another chapter on Inanna's journey called From the Great Above to the Great Below. You can read along in the pages I've uploaded. From the great above, she opened her ear to the great below. From the great above, the goddess opened her ear to the great below. And she abandoned earth and heaven to descend to the underworld. My lady abandoned heaven and earth to descend to the underworld. She abandoned her temple and so on and so on. Why did she go to the underground? Well, at one point she hears her dark sister Rishkigal moaning, and she's moaning because she's about to give birth or something like that. It's interesting. Do you remember these names we heard earlier in the Halupa tree? We heard Inki, E-N-K-I, and then we hear Arishkigal. Both of them have the words K-I in them. Ki was the name of a mother goddess that was resplendent, and so there's a connection to her with the old goddess, as if these are all splinterings of this ancient mother goddess. And the Sumerians did worship a mother goddess named Ki, but she had already lost some of her powers by the time the Sumerians had written this down or were extolling the virtues of these stories. So Inanna then goes into this underworld, right? And she's like, she's all adorned. She's putting, and everybody down in the underworld is like, whoa, you can't do this. You are a living thing. You have sexuality. In the land of dead, there is nothing sexual about it. It is dead, meaning there's no reproduction, there's no creation, there's no fertility, there's no abundance in that way. The laws of the dead are like fully in place. But she says she wants to go down into the underworld. She wants that journey. There's for whatever reason. And so she has to go through these 7 gates. And at each gate, she ends up having to give up a part of herself. The first is her beautiful robes, then her lapis lazuli necklaces. Then she has to get rid of her family. She will be a daughter of no one. Then she has to get rid of her memories, so on and so forth, till what the only thing that is really left of her is the core of her. And when her dark sister Erishkigal sees her, she says, "You're not allowed here." And she kills Inanna and hangs her on a hook. And there Inanna waits for 3 nights, 3 days. Does that sound familiar? So this story then of this journey into the dark is one that comes from somewhere. I'm going to share the screen as I often do. Okay, let's see. So the story then, here it is. You have this picture of Inanna, and here's the great above and the great below. And the story of her traveling in the darkness is one that sets the stage for a myriad of other myths, especially myths at this time. But the first one that comes to mind for me could be the argument of Little Red Riding Hood, right? It is the girl who goes into the darkness and faces something really scary in order to get to the other side. This story was also seen in later Greek myth when you have the separation of Demeter and her daughter Persephone, and she has to go stay the months in the underworld before she is able to come back and see her mom, which brings springtime back, right? So this is stuff you might be familiar with. Erishkigal is a lot like Hecate. Hecate is the grandmother goddess of the underworld who gave one of her torches to Persephone when Persephone was walking around roaming the underworld like cold and alone and dark. And so we have different myths of this underworld journey, this dark journey. Even Egyptian mythology, you have Isis who goes to put her lover Osiris back together again, and she journeys into this dark world. We even have, yes, it's called syncretism. The idea of Jesus going into the underworld for 3 nights is also a part of this value of the soul ripening, meaning the journey that is sacred that we have written down via Inanna's journey and even Inky, these journeys that were of going to different parts of reality or different worlds, right? Heaven, earth, and below, is this complete cycle necessary for the human to become fully realized, fully awakened, fully evolved, fully whatever you want to call it. It's a spiritual journey. This is also arguably where they say, there's an argument that says all of this stuff with the myth comes from the cycles of the moon, right? Yeah, we're going to get into solar, the sun myth later in the hero. But right now, I want you to check this out. So the setup, what is the setup? The setup is like the new moon. The setup is once upon a time, there was a little girl named Little Red Riding Hood, and she decided she wanted to go see her grandmother. And then you have the conflict. What is the conflict? Where all of a sudden she's visited by this wolf. And then the climax, and you know, there's some different climaxes. Sometimes the wolf kills the grandmother. Sometimes the wolf is, you know, you can see different stories, right, of what happens with the wolf, but it's ultimately like, oh, grandmother, what big eyes you have. And then a woodsman kills the wolf, and that is resolved. So you have this idea that the setup right here is dark of the moon, and the climax is the full moon. And then the resolution and all this happens at this dark moment. And so being in the dark under the world for 3 days is also, there is a dark moon for 3 days. So you could argue that lunar myth is where stories really come from. It's the observance, again, of that very early calendar. Okay. So let's get back into where we are at this point in our history in the Bronze Age. Is we are leaving behind goddess culture and goddess theory in that latitudinal line that showed all of the remarkable artwork, imagery, and livelihood that existed for thousands of years. Where, remember, there was low valley residence, meaning, remember Catalhayak, when everything was built down in a valley, not up on a hill. Meaning there was no fear that enemies were going to come knock out your whole settlement. No fortifications, no walls, no fortresses. All grave excavations show no sign of sacrifice, and nothing like hierarchical wealth value, like there was some great leader who got buried with a bunch of horses or buried with a ton of gold or something like that. No imagery of violence. Thousands of figurines, right? Dating from 30,000 years to 2000 BC. The tomb is the womb, meaning the sacred place was not heaven, but it was under the earth. The underworld in goddess theory means the goddess is rejuvenative. She's the goddess of life, death, and rebirth or regeneration. Regeneration means that the goddess, as the whole totality of all, takes back the person who is dead and regenerates them so that they have a different existence. They move on. Like, so her belly, the underworld, is where the regenerative powers are stored. Hence why we bury people in the ground, or why there are bones in the ground, et cetera, et cetera. Becomes soil for whatever is new, right? Women have equality in leadership. When you're looking at all of the studies from so many of these places, it's not that women were worshipped, it's that women showed equal measure of being able to own businesses, business practices. And you do still see this in some Sumerian texts. You see that, especially royal women, the wives, the sisters, the daughters of the chieftains, like Enheduanna, they have a voice. Enheduanna, as a priestess who's got all of this wonderful poetry that hundreds and hundreds of years later, at least 500 years later, her poetry is what the Akkadians and early Babylonians were reading and reciting. But then you have, at this time, the Indo-European philosophy, which is basically what we have today. still in some parts. Just like you could argue we still have some goddess, we have goddess philosophy in terms of cultural islands. And as we get it, you look at fairy tales or you look at whatever, you have these shafts of those moments as flash, where we have some kind of remembrance of the sacred marriage, remembrance of the goddess associated with whatever parts of nature. And you could certainly argue that when you look at almost any Disney princess. That's another conversation. So with Indo-European philosophy, you have this, again, suddenly you have these, you're building fortresses now. You no more figurines. You do have the clay stuff, and now you have a whole new writing system, but the metal for war, now you have metal instead of husbandry, like metal where you're developing it for your, your cattle and fencing and this, now it's used to be able to defend and to fight. Grave sites are now changed at this time period. And we're talking, right, those migrations from 4000 BC, go back early in the first, here we go. Let's take a look real quick. 4000 to 1000, that's when all these migrations were going on. So it is kind of spread out all over the place over a lot of time. But this idea of the changing philosophy, the changing of the guard, it's pretty, the evidence is pretty clear. Now you've got grave sites where animals and people and wealth is buried with the chieftains. Now you've got evidence of a hierarchy that exists. All the goddesses you see, that we will start to see, are squeezed out of power. Either they're vilified, demonized, or anyway becoming secondary characters. So instead of kind of a crystallization of a goddess and a god, you have a splintering where it just becomes a vision of that new philosophy. We're going to get into that with the Greeks. Now you've got violence, you've got extreme graphic imagery of cruelty, rape, torture, and then the tribal consciousness. I'm going to talk about tribal consciousness more in the next lecture video series on the hero. And yeah, so I'm going to probably stop there. Questions? Be perhaps on your first unit quiz. Is Inanna, as this triple woman, is she a splintering of the great goddess from going to the heavens, to the earth, and to the underground? What is sacred marriage? I think we talked about that. What is lunar myth? We talked about that. What does the great reversal mean? So the great reversal then is this time period of these migrations of these Indo-European Kurgan invaders that basically reshuffled and reset and rewound all of the sophistication, the art, and the cultures that were flourishing at this time period. Because now what is going to happen is you're going to see there is a big dark period, and we won't have any kind of real enlightenment that you could see in many parts of the world until we have the onset of the golden age of Greece. That's coming up in a little while. But we still have to get through the Iron Age, which is a very, very dark period in our history. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, I think we covered that well enough. So now what will happen, and you'll see this in the hero myth, or the hero lecture, the Enuma Elish is a Babylonian creation myth. It kind of takes the place of the Halupo tree, or it starts to rewrite its own ideas. What's happening? It's finally taking more and more of what you'll see finally in Genesis or in the Hebrew creation stories, and you'll start to see elements of it. A goddess is demonized, turned into a dragon, and slaughtered by her great-great-great-grandson. Gilgamesh is also still considered a hero, and there are tales extolling his virtues at this point, and that's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's also for another time. So I'm going to stop there, and it's a good place to stop. This will be the end of our Bronze Age work So I hope you enjoyed some of the stuff looking into some of our Sumerian poetry.